Greetings, traveler of the void. You have entered the domain of void-born terrors. What you are about to hear was not meant for your ears. It was scraped from the dying machine spirit of a Munitorum Vox thief, recovered from a drop pod that crashed on a world the Imperium insists does not need rescuing. The Adeptus Administratum has, of course, denied the recording's existence. The Inquisition has, of course, redacted 9 passages. What remains is the voice of a man, a trooper, a scribe. His name is in no regimental record. His grave is on no Imperial map. Before we begin the transmission, traveler, secure your Geller field by striking the rune of approval upon this chronicle. Join the crew by enlisting in our ranks below. Sound the bell of notification so that no future transmission is lost to the static of the warp. The Emperor sees only those who are recorded. Make certain you are seen. Now, steel your soul, lower the lumen, and listen. This is the testimony of Trooper 7741 Gamma, Vyrden Penal Auxilia, or so he believed. Chapter 1. The Ledger that was never stamped. I do not know if anyone hears this. I do not know if anyone can hear someone who is not there. My name is Vekker Hesh. I am a Trooper 7741 Gamma of the 412th Vyrden Penal Auxilia. I was a scribe in the lower habstacks of Vyrden Secundus before the tithe shortfall of the year 8.213. I was conscripted on the 3rd day of the Feast of Imperial Restitution, given a lasgun I did not know how to hold, and shipped through the warp in a troop transport called the Stoic Endurance. The ship's name was a lie. The ship endured nothing. The ship was very tired. I begin this record because the others will not. Sergeant Core does not write. Knuckles cannot spell. Old Calder refuses on principle. And Corporal Thren, well, Corporal Thren has been writing for some time now. But not the things I write. Not the things anyone should write. I begin this record because if I do not, no one will ever know we were here. And I am beginning to suspect that no one knows we are here even now. The drop was the first time I understood that something was wrong. You must know that a Munitorum pattern troop transport is a wretched thing. It is hollowed out cargo tonnage, given just enough piety to bear human freight. Rust-pocked benches bolted to the deck plates, restraint harnesses gone brittle with age. The sour reek of recycled air filtered through filtration cogitators that had not been blessed by a tech priest in living memory. The lumen strips above us hummed with the dying machine voice of dying things. They sputtered in a rhythm that was almost the cadence of the litany of disembarkation, but with one note missing. The note you would expect, the note that would make it holy. I sat between Trooper Joss Vaneth, whom we all called Knuckles, and a man whose name I never quite caught, and whose face I will not be able to recall in 3 days' time. Knuckles was making a bet. Knuckles was always making bets. He had wagered 3 days of his ration pack that he would be the first man to vomit upon making planetfall, and he was diligently working himself toward winning the bet by staring fixedly at the bulkhead. The bulkhead, in fairness, was not helping him. It had begun to weep a slow, oily condensate that smelled faintly of incense and corpse starch. Each droplet ran down the riveted plating and pooled in the seam where the deck plate met the wall. Each droplet, when it pooled, made a small wet sound, plip, plip, plip. The sound was not in rhythm with the lumen strips. This bothered me. I cannot say why. Across the troop bay, Sergeant Marbas Core was reading. He always read before a drop, a small battered devotional, its cover so worn that the embossed aquila had been rubbed down to a pair of vague wings and a suggestion of a head. Core was a veteran of 17 worlds. He kept a private ledger, separate from the regimental rolls, in which he wrote down the name of every man he had ever lost. The ledger was thick. The ledger was, I noticed even then, much thicker than 17 worlds should have made it. Father Telik, the regimental confessor, was walking the aisle, blessing each man with a touch of consecrated oil upon the brow. When he came to me, his thumb pressed against my forehead and lingered a moment longer than it should have. His lips moved. I caught only the tail of the words. "And may he account thee in his ledger, child, for thou art so easily forgotten." Father Telik moved on. I did not ask him to repeat himself. I think I did not want him to. The Gellerfield hummed. The Gellerfield hummed wrong. I have no training in the engineering arts. I am only a scribe. But I have spent 1,000 night shifts in the understacks of Vyrden Secundus, listening to the building cogitators chant their maintenance litanies. And a man learns the cadence of a healthy machine spirit the way a shepherd learns the bleating of healthy flock. The stoic endurance's Gellerfield hummed in a key that I would describe, if I were a musician, as minor. If I were a priest, I would be sorrowful. If I were honest, I was hungry. It was not screaming. It was not failing. It was simply hungry, in the way that very old, very patient things become hungry when no one has fed them in a long time. The Fleet Master's voice crackled over the Troop Bay Vox. He recited the deployment roll. Transport 1, designation Stoic Endurance, confirmed. Transport 2, Pilgrim's Burden, confirmed. I counted the confirmations under my breath as he read them. We had been told, at muster, that 14 transports were translating in-system information. 14, a holy number. 14, 3 for the Emperor's 3 pillars of dominion, 4 for the cardinal aspects of his mercy, and the doubling of 7 for the 7 scourges of the warp. The Fleet Master's voice reached Transport 11, vow of the diligent hand, confirmed. Then there was a pause, a very long pause. I heard a Vox officer somewhere muttering in the background, asking the question I was beginning to want to ask. Transports 1 through 11 confirmed. All Vyrden Auxilia accounted for. Deployment commencing. Knuckles, beside me, was still staring at the bulkhead. He had not heard. I leaned toward him. "Knuckles," he said, 11. "Yeah." It was supposed to be 14. Knuckles, who could not spell but who could count well enough to win a wager, considered this. He considered it for some time. Then he shrugged, a small shrug constrained by his restraint harness, and said, "Maybe they got reassigned. Maybe they never left. Munitorum, innit? Half the time the paperwork shoots itself before it leaves the dispatch tube." He said it lightly. He said it as one says the small lies one tells to ward off the night. But I saw, because I was a scribe, and a scribe sees these things, that his knuckles, which had been white upon his laser gun, had gone whiter still. He had heard. He had simply chosen not to count. The drop klaxons sounded, the deck shuddered. The stoic endurance committed itself to the atmosphere. Father Telik began the litany of disembarkation, and we all joined in. And somewhere in the singing, the missing note hummed silently in the back of my throat, where I could feel it but could not give it sound. I did not vomit when we made planetfall. Knuckles did. He won his bet against no one in particular, and he would not collect on it. The muster yard on Karybdis-Aether was vast, and it was wrong, and I could not say at first why. Picture, traveler, a plain of rockcrete stretching to a horizon that was the wrong color. The sky above us was the bruised yellow of an old wound, smeared at its edges with a violet that crept toward black wherever you tried to look at it directly. The wind came across that plain in a slow exhalation, carrying the smell of dust and ozone and something sweeter beneath, something organic and overripe. I thought at the time of the spice orchards of Vyrden Secundus before the harvest, when the fruit had hung too long upon the bough and begun to turn. I thought of it because the smell was almost the same. It was not the same, but it was close enough that my hindbrain offered up the memory, the way a frightened animal offers up its belly. The Munitorum had carved this muster yard out of the hillside before we arrived. Supply crates stood in disciplined rows, stenciled with regimental insignia and shipment codes, all stamped with the seal of the Departmento. Cargo servitors moved among them, unloading, sorting, restacking. The servitors hummed their endless work litanies. The crates were beautiful in their geometry. Everything was in its place. Everything was efficient. I was a scribe. I read the stamp marks. I read them because I could not help reading them. A scribe, traveler, does not look at parchment. A scribe suffers parchment the way a sailor suffers the sea. Words crawl into him without invitation. And so as I marched past the cargo stacks, I read. The crates bore shipment codes from the dispatch hubs of Cypramundi and Bacca. This was unremarkable. The crates bore receipt stamps from the Munitorum quartermasters of the Karybdis-Aether reclamation effort. This was also unremarkable. The crates bore date stamps reading 812.M41 through 8.213.M41, which placed their dispatch within the past 3 years. This was again unremarkable. But beneath those date stamps, faint, half rubbed off, lay older stamps. Stamps the Munitorum clerks had bothered to ink over, but not to remove. And those stamps, in the cramped little numerals of the Departmento's archive cogitators, read M39, 2,000 years. 2,000 standard years of Imperial dating between when those crates had first been stamped and when they had been received here. I stopped walking. A trooper behind me cursed and shoved me forward. I kept walking. I did not stop reading. Old Calder, who marched beside me with the slow shuffle of a man whose joints had been campaigning for longer than mine had been alive, glanced sideways at me. His face was a topographical study in burst capillaries and pale, wattled skin, and his eyes were the color of unfired pottery, dust gray, and they were watching me read. "You see it, scribe?" he said. His voice was very low. "The dates," I said. "Aye." "They were dispatched in M39. "Aye." "That's not possible." Old Calder did not answer me. He looked away to the long horizon of bruised yellow sky, and his lips moved, and I think he was praying. He was praying to someone, but I could not tell whether it was the Emperor or someone older and quieter than the Emperor. He said nothing more. He marched. I marched. I made my first mark in this journal that evening. I wrote, "The crates here are older than the war they were sent to supply. I do not understand. I do not understand. I do not understand." I wrote it 3 times because 3 is a holy number, and because writing it once did not seem enough. The roll call was conducted in the great open square of the muster yard, beneath a temporary Munitorum awning that flapped in the dry wind with a sound like flagging banners at a funeral. Sergeant Corr stood at the head of our squad, with his battered devotional tucked under one arm and his data slate held in the other. The data slate's pict screen flickered in the way of all Munitorum data slates, a slow, arthritic pulse, as if the machine spirit within were drawing breath through some great and ancient affliction. Corr called the names. We answered. "Trooper Joss." "Sir." "Present, sir." "Trooper Vekker Hesh." "Sir." "Present, sir." He went down the roll. We answered. There were 36 of us in the squad, organized into 3 sections of 12. Corr called name after name. Most answered. 3 did not. "Trooper Olm, Berwick." Silence. "Trooper Olm, Berwick Olm." Silence. I looked along the line. There was no Trooper Olm standing in our formation. I did not remember a Trooper Olm. I did not remember not remembering one either. which is a different thing and a worse thing. There was simply a gap in my recollection of the transport bay where a man named Ulm ought to have been, and my mind would not enter that gap to investigate. Trooper Halvarith Sennen. Silence. Trooper Halvarith. Silence. Trooper Mensk Colin. Silence. Sergeant Kaur lowered the data slate. His face did not change. Kaur's face never changed. That was part of how Kaur had endured 17 worlds. But the muscle at the corner of his jaw tightened, and his fingers, which were the fingers of a man who had once been a longshoreman in his civilian life, closed very slowly around the rim of the slate until the brittle cogitator glass creaked. "Adept Vol," Kaur said, without looking up. The adept came forward. I had not, until that moment, looked properly at Adept Quinton Vol. He was a thin man, or what remained of a thin man, wrapped in the rust-red robes of the Adeptus Mechanicus, though only the lowest tier of those robes. The grey cordings of a tech adept of the Munitorum's clerical subfane, scribe class rather than artificer. His face was half a face. The right side was sallow human skin and a single watery blue eye. The left side was a brass dataport set into the bone, ringed by tarnished gold filigree, with 3 mechadendrites that emerged from beneath his hood and busied themselves with a small, chittering ledger stylus. When he spoke, his voice was the dry rattle of a parchment scroll being unrolled across a metal table. "Sergeant, 3 of my men have not answered roll. There are no men of those names on the manifest of the 412th Vyrden Penal Auxilia, Sergeant." Kaur was quiet for a moment. Then he turned the data slate to face the adept and pointed, with one thick finger, at 3 lines. "They are here. Ulm, Beric, Halvarith Sennen, Mensk Kaulin, on this slate, which the Munitorum issued me, which I have carried through warp transit." Vol inclined his head with the slow grace of a man considering a difficult clerical question. His mechadendrites chittered. The ledger stylus made a small, fastidious mark. "The slate, Sergeant, is in error. The slate has not been reconciled against the Master Manifest held in the Regimental Cogitator Shrine. The Master Manifest is the authoritative document. The Master Manifest does not contain those names. My slate was the Master Manifest at muster on Vyrden. The slate, Sergeant, is in error. I called those names 6 days ago, in the troop bay of the Stoic Endurance, and 3 men answered to them. Then the men were also in error, Sergeant. Such errors will of course be reconciled in due course by the Departmento. In the meanwhile, if those men are not present, they were not deployed. If they were not deployed, they cannot be missing. They cannot be absent. They are not, technically speaking, anywhere." I watched Kaur's hand close around the rim of the data slate. I watched the brittle cogitator glass spider into a slow web of cracks. The slate's pict screen flickered once, twice, and then steadied, and when it steadied, the 3 lines were gone. The roster now read 33 names. It had always, I would later be required to swear, read 33 names. Kaur opened his mouth. He did not, however, get the chance to speak. Commissar Haend had been watching from the edge of the muster square. I had not noticed him until that moment, which was strange, because a commissar is generally the first thing a sensible guardsman notices in any given environment. Haend was a tall man, neither young nor old, his face the smooth and untroubled face of a senior bureaucrat. His greatcoat was immaculate. His cap was set perfectly square. He carried no visible weapon, though his bolt pistol holster was, I noted, well oiled and worn to the precise contours of a hand that had drawn it often. He did not approach us. He simply looked at Sergeant Kaur from across the square, and Sergeant Kaur, who had endured 17 worlds. Sergeant Kaur lowered the data slate and said very evenly, "As you say, Adept, slate error. I will see to its reconciliation." "Very good, Sergeant." "Squad," Kaur said, Dismissed billet. We went. I did not look back. I made myself not look back, which is harder than looking back, and which I have since learned is the more important skill in the Emperor's service. I had a letter to send. I should not have written it. A trooper of the Imperial Guard does not need to write letters. A trooper of the Imperial Guard has been issued forms, and the forms are sufficient. Form 237-Vic. The notice of continued service was already drafted on my behalf and would be sent to my next of kin upon my deployment to a designated combat zone, attesting that I remained, as of the date of its dispatch, operational. Should I cease to be operational, Form 2238-Vic, the notice of honorable discontinuation would be sent in its place. The system was sufficient. The system was elegant. The system had been refined over 10,000 years. But I was a scribe, and I had a sister. Her name was Vekker Hesh, and she worked in the spice conditioning vats, 2 sub-levels below where I had worked, and she had wept the day they came for me with my conscription warrant, and I had told her, I had promised her, that I would write. I had promised her not the Munitorum form, which she had received many times for many men in our hab block, and which she had learned to hate, but a real letter, in my own hand, with my own ink. I wrote it that evening in my billet, by the gutter of a single lumen candle that the quartermaster had grudgingly issued, in lieu of a proper lumen strip. I wrote it on 3 folded sheets of pulped fiber paper I had taken with me from Vyrden, folded against my chest beneath my flak vest, through the entire warp transit. I wrote it carefully. I did not tell her about the crates. I did not tell her about the 3 names that had vanished. I did not tell her about Father Telek's strange blessing, or the Geller Field's hungry hum, or old Calder's eyes the color of unfired pottery. I told her instead about the color of the sky on Karybdis-Aether, which I described as the color of a peach left too long in the sun. I told her about Knuckles, who had won his bet and would not collect on it. I told her that the food was bad, but the company was strange, and that I would write again as soon as I could. I sealed the letter with a smear of wax from the lumen candle and pressed my thumbprint into the wax, because I had no signet, and because a thumbprint is, in its own way, a kind of name. The mail clerk's tent was 3 rows over, near the supply dump. The mail clerk was a young man, perhaps younger than I, with the pallid skin of someone who had spent his service indoors. He took my letter without looking at it. He did not ask my name. He did not ask my squad. He did not ask my service number. He took the folded sheets of pulped fiber as a man takes a leaf that has blown into his lap on a windy afternoon, without interest, without consideration, almost without acknowledging that the leaf had ever been a leaf. He placed it in a wire basket beside his desk. The basket was already half full. "For dispatch with the next mail courier, sir?" I asked. "Aye," said the mail clerk. He did not look up. "My next of kin is on Vyrden Secundus. The address is..." "It's on the letter, isn't it?" "Yes, sir, but I wanted to confirm." "Then it'll find its way." He did not look up. He did not look up because he was, I realized, not reading anything. There was no parchment on his desk. There was no stylus in his hand. There was no manifest open in front of him. There was a wire basket, and there was an empty desk, and there was the young man. And he was looking at nothing with the soft attentiveness of a man who has been looking at nothing for a long time and finds it restful. I left. I walked back toward my billet by the long way, because my mind was uneasy, and walking helped, and because the long way took me behind the supply dump, where a brazier had been lit against the chill of the Charybdic night. The brazier was a Munitorum standard iron drum with ventilation slits punched into its sides, the kind we burned refuse papers in at the dispatch hub on Vyrden. Standing beside the brazier, warming his hands, was the same young mail clerk. He had a stack of letters beside him. He was, with the casual rhythm of a man performing a long familiar duty, feeding them into the fire one at a time. Each letter caught quickly and burned with a bright yellow flame. The yellow flame smelled faintly of incense. I stood in the dark beyond the brazier's circle of light, and I watched, and I did not breathe. And the mail clerk fed letter after letter into the fire, and after some little time, he picked up a folded packet of 3 sheets of pulped fiber paper sealed with a smear of lumen candle wax. He held it for a moment, considering it as a man considers a piece of fruit before he eats it. Then he placed it into the flame. The wax melted. My thumbprint, which I had pressed into the wax to give the letter a name, ran liquid and was gone. The mail clerk did not look at me. He did not know I was there. He had no reason to know I was there, because a man who has burned a letter has, in a small and bureaucratic way, burned the writer of the letter also. The writer ceases to be a writer and becomes merely a sender of nothing. And to a man whose work it is to burn letters, a sender of nothing is exactly the same as a man who never sent. I, standing in the dark, was not a man who had written to his sister. I was a man who had never written. I had always not written. I had been not writing my whole life. The mail clerk hummed. I recognized the tune. It was the Litany of Disembarkation. The note that should have been there was, again, missing. I did not sleep that night. The march to the front began the next morning, and I will speak briefly of it because there is little to say. The sun on Karybdis-Aether, when it rose, rose in the west. I do not mean this as a metaphor, traveler, nor as the loose-tongued exaggeration of a frightened man. I mean this as a fact. The Munitorum issued chronopict on my wrist confirmed it. East and west had been agreed upon at our muster briefing the day before, in reference to the orientation of the orbital survey maps. The sun, by every observable indication, rose from the wrong horizon and traveled across the sky in the wrong direction, and set that evening in what had been the east at dawn. Sergeant Corps did not remark upon this. None of the veterans did. I gathered from this silence that to remark upon such things was not done. I did not remark upon it either. I made a small note in the margin of my journal. Sun wrong, no one will say. We marched for 9 hours through fields of grain. The grain was the second wrongness, and the wrongness I will not soon forget. It was wheat, or what had been wheat, before the human settlers of Karybdis-Aether had abandoned this world or been abandoned by it. But it had not been tended in centuries, and what tends grain when men do not tend it is the soil and the wind, and whatever else lives in the soil and the wind. The grain on Karybdis-Aether had decided, in its long, unwatched solitude, that it would grow in spirals. Not random spirals, traveler. Spirals of consistent radius and pitch, opening counterclockwise across each field, so that to walk across a field of Karybdic wheat was to walk through a vast and patient mathematical proposition that had been laid down by something with all the time in the world, and a strong preference for one direction over the other. The wheat brushed our knees. The wheat whispered. The wheat smelled very faintly of incense and corpse starch. Knuckles, who had recovered his cheer somewhat with the morning, walked beside me and tried to make a bet about how many spirals we would cross before sundown. I did not take the bet. He tried to make a different bet. I did not take that one either. He tried to make a third bet, smaller, easier, almost free, and I would have taken it for charity's sake had not Corporal Yelva Thren, who walked ahead of us with the voxcaster on her back, stopped abruptly in the middle of a spiral and tilted her head, the way a hound tilts its head at a sound it cannot place. "Channel 3, she said, to no one in particular. "What?" said Knuckles. "Channel 3 is hot." "We don't have a Channel 3 on the regimental array, Yelva," I said. I had attended the briefing. I had taken notes. I was even now the scribe. "I know," said Corporal Thren. "I know we don't." She walked on. She did not adjust the Voxcaster. The Voxcaster, however, did adjust itself. Its tuning knob, of brass burnished by long use, made a single small clockwise tick. The tick was very soft. I heard it because I was a scribe and I heard small things. Corporal Thren did not look down at it. Corporal Thren kept walking, and the Voxcaster kept ticking, slowly, 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 advancing one notch at a time, as if some patient hand on the other end of an unmarked channel were tuning her in. I did not write that down then. I was afraid to. I write it now. The trenches, when we reached them at dusk, were pristine. I want you to understand what this means, traveler. A trench system that has been occupied by Imperial Guardsmen for any length of time is not a place. It is an organism. It accretes. The duckboards develop their characteristic warps from the boots of specific men, and one can, walking a long-occupied trench, sometimes tell where the tall men have stood watch by the bowing of the boards beneath the firing step. The walls develop their characteristic stains. The brown-black of dried blood, the green-black of latrine seepage, the white-grey bloom of saltpeter crusted around old chemical burn marks, the small dark spots of countless lecho stick ashes flicked against the revetments by countless bored men. The bunkers acquire their nicknames, which are scratched into the lintels with bayonets. The sandbags acquire their familiar slumps. The corner junctions acquire their small private graves, where the regimental rats are interred by the men who killed them in moments of off-duty cruelty. A trench is the sum of everyone who has lived in it. The trench system on Karybdis-Aether had no sum. Its duckboards lay flat and unwarped, freshly cut. Its walls were the clean grey of recently poured rockcrete revetted with sandbags that bore no slump, no stain, no crust. Its bunkers had no nicknames. Its sandbags were not even properly settled. They had been stacked, in the past few days at most, by hands that had not yet learned the trench's preferences. There were no rat graves. There were no ellow-stick ash marks. There were no boot prints in the mud of the firing step, except our own, fresh, registering for the first time. We had been told, at the briefing, that the Vyrden 61st had held this line for 3 weeks before rotating out. The Vyrden 61st, if they had been here, had been very, very tidy. Sergeant Corr stood at the firing step of the main trench and looked along its length for some time. His face did not change. Corr's face did not change. But his hand, the hand that did not hold his battered devotional, rested for a long moment on the rim of a sandbag, and his thumb worked slowly back and forth across the rough Hessian fiber, as if he were testing whether the sandbag was real. The sandbag did not provide him an answer. The sandbag was presumably real. "Sergeant," I said. "Trooper Hesh, the 61st. They were here 3 weeks." "That is what the briefing officer informed us, Trooper. There's no sign of them, Sergeant." Corr did not look at me. He looked along the trench. He looked at the duckboards and the walls and the sandbags, and his thumb worked the Hessian, and after some little while he said very quietly, "Trooper Hesh, there is one thing I have learned in 17 worlds of the Emperor's service. Sergeant, it is that the Departmento Munitorum is never wrong about what regiment held a sector. If the Departmento Munitorum tells you a regiment held this sector for 3 weeks, then a regiment held this sector for 3 weeks. The trench may disagree. The mud may disagree. Your own 2 eyes may disagree. The Departmento Munitorum is never wrong." "Yes, Sergeant." "Take first watch." "Yes, Sergeant." He left me there. He walked back along the trench to assign the others to their billets. I took my place on the firing step and faced out across the spiral wheat fields, toward whatever waited beyond them in the bruise-yellow dusk. I was alone for 2 hours. The wheat whispered. The Voxcaster, somewhere behind me in the comms dugout, ticked softly at intervals as Corporal Thren, off-duty, off-roster, off-charter, sat beside it and listened to a channel that did not exist. I heard the small dry rasp of her stylus on parchment. I knew, without knowing how I knew, that she was writing down names. The sun set in the east. I watched it set. I did not look away. When the sun was gone and the lumen strips along the trench had sputtered on with their dying machine cadence, I looked down to settle myself against the firing step, and I saw, half buried in the fresh mud at my feet, where no boot but mine had ever stood, a small flat circle of dull metal, a dog tag. I bent. I worked it loose from the mud with my thumb. I held it up to the guttering lumen light. It was a standard Imperial guard tag, oval cut, stamped in the cheap pressed steel of the line regiments. It bore, in the cramped engraving of a Munitorum stamping press, Hesh, volume 7741-Delta, Code 412, Vyrden Pen. Auxiliary issued, 8.173.M41. I stared at it. My name. Hesh V for Vekker Hesh, which is who I am, which is who I have been since my mother named me in the spice conditioning vats of Vyrden Secundus. The service number was wrong by 1 letter. 7741 Delta, not 7741 Gamma. A single notch along the Munitorum's alphabetical subclassification, as if a scribe somewhere had transposed one suffix for another in the long ledger of the Emperor's soldiers. The regiment was correct. The 412th Vyrden Penal Auxilia. My regiment. The regiment that had been mustered, by the strict accounting of the Munitorum 4 months ago, after the tithe shortfall on Vyrden Secundus that had swept me and Knuckles and 34 other men into the Emperor's service. The date of issue was 8.173 in the 41st millennium of his most holy reign, 40 years before I was born. I stood on the firing step of a trench that no regiment had ever truly occupied, on a world where the sun rose in the west and the wheat grew in spirals, holding in my hand the dog tag of a man with my name and my regiment, who had been issued his service 40 years before my mother had brought me wet and crying into the understacks of Vyrden Secundus. The Voxcaster, somewhere behind me, ticked. The wheat whispered. The wind moved across the fields with a long, slow exhalation, and in that exhalation, I am as certain of this as I have ever been certain of anything I have written. I heard, very faintly, a voice. The voice was speaking low Gothic. The voice was speaking my name. The voice was using the wrong vowels. Traveller, the Gellerfield holds. For now. But the static is rising. Strike the rune of approval upon this chronicle if Vekker's testimony is to continue. Enlist with the crew below, so that no further transmissions are lost. Sound the bell, that you might hear when the next Vox Thief recording is recovered from the archive that does not, officially, exist. Speak in the comments, traveller. Speak the words that bind us all. For the Emperor. Speak them loud that he might hear. Speak them louder still that the Departmento Munitorum might hear. For it is the deafer of the two, and the more dangerous. Chapter 2. The Man in the 13th Bunk. The dugout had 12 bunks. I know this because I counted them. I counted them when we filed in that first dawn, our boots caked with the pale mud of the spiral wheat fields, the dog tag of the man with my name still warm in my fist, where I had clenched it through the long second half of my watch. I counted them as a scribe counts, not glancing, but counting, placing my eyes upon each iron-framed cot in turn, and ticking the number forward in the small private ledger of my mind. 1, 2, 3. The bunks were stacked 3 high along the long walls of the dugout, in 2 tiers of 6, and I counted each frame, and each thin straw pallet mattress, and each rolled wool blanket, and I arrived at the number 12, which is what 12 bunks make when there are 12 of them. Sergeant Corps' section numbered 13 men. I counted us too. I counted us as we entered. Corps, Thren, Vanath, Hesh, Calder, Drass, Mel, Vaughan, Pell, Sudderhast, Yen, Mock, Brenner, 13, a bad number, 13, the doubling of the 6 imperfect days of creation, plus the 1 day of error that the Emperor in his mercy forgives. 12 bunks, 13 men. I waited for someone to remark upon this. No one did. The veterans who had endured many billets chose theirs and stowed their kit. Knuckles claimed an upper bunk near the door with the cheer of a man who had won the small lottery of arrival. Old Calder took a lower bunk near the back, where the dugout's lumen strip was dimmest, with the deliberate slowness of a man who had been choosing dim bunks for a very long time. I waited until everyone had chosen. There were 12 bunks. There were 13 men. There was, when the choosing was done, 1 bunk left unclaimed. It was the middle bunk in the rearmost tier, the second tier up of the 3 against the far wall, in the deepest dark where the lumen strip's dying machine pulse barely reached. The straw pallet upon it was, like all the others, freshly issued. The wool blanket upon it was, like all the others, rolled tight in the Munitorum prescribed cylinder. The bunk frame was identical to every other bunk frame in the dugout. Nothing was distinguishing about it whatsoever, except that I had counted 12 bunks. And now, looking at the dugout, with 12 men settled into their bunks and myself standing in the aisle with my kit in my hands, I counted 13. I counted again. 13. I counted a third time. 12. I stopped counting. A scribe knows when to stop counting. A scribe knows that some sums do not wish to be totaled, and that to insist upon a sum is to provoke the sum to insist back. I took the only unclaimed bunk, a lower along the side wall near the dugout stove, and I stowed my kit, and I did not look at the middle bunk in the rearmost tier, which was occupied or unoccupied, or both, depending on how I held my eyes. Knuckles climbed down from his upper bunk and ambled to the center of the dugout and looked at the dim bunk in the back and said, with the bright, clear voice of a man making a joke against the dark, "Reckon that one's the Emperor's bed. He's resting up. Don't disturb him." A few of the men laughed. Old Calder did not laugh. Sergeant Corps, sorting his kit by his own bunk, did not laugh. I did not laugh either. Knuckles, encouraged by the laughter he did get, swept his cap off his head and bowed deeply toward the dim bunk and said, in a tone of mock solemnity, "Compliments of Trooper Vanath, sire. Sleep you well. Try not to snore." "Stow it, Vanath," said Sergeant Corps without looking up. "Just being hospitable, Sarge." "Stow it." Knuckles stowed it. He climbed back to his upper bunk. He whistled briefly, a tune from the understacks of Vyrden, and then he stopped whistling, because the tune did not seem to want to be whistled in this dugout. He lay down. He looked at the ceiling. After some time, he said, very quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, "You know, I bet I could sleep there. The Emperor's bunk. I bet I could." No one answered him. I wrote in my journal that morning, 12 bunks, 13 men. The arithmetic refuses to settle. I will not count again. I counted again 4 times that day. The cogitator shrine of the regimental command tent was a small, stooped thing, the size of a confessional booth, its brass casing dulled by long handling, and its pict screen the milky yellow of an old man's eye. Adept Vaul tended it the way a verger tends an altar, with small rags, with measured drops of consecrated oil. with murmured prayers in the binary cant of his order. The cogitator's machine spirit clicked and muttered to itself in its sleep, and Vyrden stroked its casing with his good human hand, and the lumen strip above them both pulsed weakly. Sergeant Core had assigned me to assist the adept. "You're a scribe," he had said, in the brief hour before the second watch. "Vyrden wants a clerk hand. You can read. Go." I had gone. I had not wished to go, but a scribe goes where a sergeant points, and so I had ducked through the tent flap of the command tent and presented myself to Adept Vyrden, who had inclined his half-face toward me with the slow grace of a man considering a strange insect. "Trooper Hesh," he said. His voice was the dry rasp I remembered. "Vekker?" "Yes, Adept." "You read?" "Yes, Adept." "Low Gothic, High Gothic?" "A little High Gothic, Adept. Tithe script and Munitorum cant well." "Sufficient." He turned back to the cogitator. His 3 mechadendrites busied themselves at its keys. "The slate reconciliation requires a human hand for cross-reference. The machine spirit prefers a binary supplicant, but the manifest archive contains paper records of pre-Munitorum vintage. Paper requires fingers. You have fingers. I had fingers. He set me to it. The work was simple enough, cross-checking names from a battered paper manifest, 2 centuries old by its dating, against the cogitator's current roles. The paper manifest was a quartermaster's record from a regiment called the Vyrden 48th, long since stricken from the rolls and reconstituted under other numerals. My task was to verify that none of the 48th's names had been duplicated into the 412th by clerical accident. It was tedious.
It was the kind of work I had done in the understacks of Vyrden for 14 years.
I read paper names. I called them out. Vyrden carried the cogitator. The cogitator answered, "Not in the roll, not in the roll, not in the roll." The little brass machine's spirit rattled with each answer, contented in its task. I called name after name. None matched. I was reassured in some small corner of my mind by the orderliness of the work. Then the cogitator hiccuped. It was a small hiccup, the kind a cogitator shrine sometimes produces when a poorly blessed circuit relay misfires. The pick screen flickered. A different screen. A screen I had not been looking at. A screen that was not the manifest reconciliation interface. Appeared for perhaps the duration of a single drawn breath. The screen displayed a deployment status report. It read, "In the cramped Munitorum hand, 412, Vyrden Pen. AUX. Status, Patriarch. Casualty rate, 100%. Date of final reconciliation, 8.214.m41, day 213. I stared at the screen. The current date was 8.213.m41, day 46. The screen was reporting our regiment's casualty figures from 6 standard months hence, 100%. Patriarch. The word was a Munitorum technical term. It meant a deployment in which mission objectives were achieved, but unit was rendered non-functional for further service. It meant we had won and died. It meant the cogitator shrine already knew this. It meant the cogitator shrine had filed it in the future tense. I drew in a small, quiet breath. Adept Vyrden's good blue eye flicked to my face. Then it flicked to the screen. Then it flicked back to my face. His 3 mechadendrites, which had been chittering at the keys, went still all at once. "Trooper Hesh." "Yes, Adept." "You did not see that screen." "Adept." "The screen does not exist. The screen was not displayed. The cogitator did not produce it. Verify." His voice was very level. His good blue eye did not blink. The brass data port in the left side of his skull whirred faintly, a small accusing whir, and I understood. with the precision a scribe brings to his understanding, that what was happening in this moment was not a request, and was not a threat, and was not a kindness. It was a correction. Vaul was offering me the opportunity to correct an error. The error was my having seen. If I did not correct the error, Vaul would presumably be obliged to escalate. I looked at the picked screen. The screen was the manifest reconciliation interface. It displayed names from the Vyrden 48. It had, presumably, always displayed names from the Vyrden 48th. I had been mistaken. A trick of fatigue. A flicker of a poorly blessed relay. There had been no other screen. Verified adept, I said. There was no other screen. Very good, Trooper Hesh. His mechadendrites resumed their work. His good blue eye returned to the keys. Continue the reconciliation. I continued the reconciliation. My hands were steady. My voice, as I read out the next name, was steady. My mind was not steady. My mind was running. In a small, dark corridor of itself, the word Pyrrhic. The word Pyrrhic. The word Pyrrhic. Over and over, the way a child running from a thing in a corridor runs the rhythm of his own running feet. When I left the command tent 2 hours later, Adept Vaul did not look up, but his mechadendrite stylus made a small, fastidious mark in a private ledger I had not been given leave to read, and I understood that I had now been marked also. The first patrol returned at dusk. There had been 3 men in the patrol. Sergeant Corps had dispatched them at midday, understanding orders to reconnoiter a derelict farmstead, a kilometer beyond the forward wire. Standard work. A milk run, as the veteran said, though no one on Karybdis-Aether said it loudly. 2 men returned. The third was Trooper Olm. I write Trooper Olm. And I must stop. I must put down my stylus. I must look at the dugout wall a moment and consider what I am about to write, because what I am about to write is impossible. And a scribe who writes impossible things must do so deliberately, or he will lose the habit of writing true things. I had not known a Trooper Olm. Trooper Olm had not been on our roll call in the muster square. Trooper Olm's name had been one of the 3 Sergeant Corps had called and received no answer to. Trooper Olm had been reconciled, Adept Vaul's word, into non-existence by the master manifest of the Cogitator Shrine. Trooper Olm was not deployed. Trooper Olm could not be missing. Trooper Olm was not, technically speaking, anywhere. Trooper Olm walked into the dugout at dusk, supported between his 2 patrol mates. His face was the color of unbleached linen. His eyes were open. His eyes did not move. His mouth hung slack, and from the slackness of his mouth, a thin, clear fluid ran down his chin and dripped slowly onto the front of his fatigues, where it had been dripping, evidently, for some time. His tongue was gone. I do not mean that his tongue had been torn out. A torn tongue leaves a wound, leaves blood, leaves the ragged white-pink ruin of severed muscle. Trooper Olm's tongue was not torn. Trooper Olm's tongue was absent, with the clean, smooth absence of something that had been excised by a careful instrument in a careful hand. The inside of his mouth, where his tongue should have been, was a neat surgical flaw, healed pink, as if the absence had been there for weeks. The clear fluid was saliva. He had simply forgotten how to swallow. "What in the throne's name happened to him?" Sergeant Corps said. His voice was very quiet. The 2 patrol mates looked at each other. Then they looked at Corps. Then one of them, Trooper Sutterhast, said, "Sarge, we don't know." "You don't know." "He was with us. He was with us, Sarge. We were walking back. He was fine. He said something, a joke, I think. And then we turned a corner around a fence post, and he was like this. Around a fence post." "Aye, Sarge. A fence post. We were not 3 paces apart." Corps looked at Olm. Olm looked at nothing. The clear saliva dripped. Old Calder, who had been sitting quietly on his bunk through this, rose and approached. He did not look at Olm's face. He looked at Olm's pockets, with a gentleness that surprised me. The gentleness of a man who has performed this small task many times. He reached into the breast pocket of Olm's fatigues and withdrew a folded sheet of parchment. He unfolded it. He read it. His unfired pottery eyes went still. He passed it without speaking to Sergeant Corr. Corr read it. Corr's face did not change. Corr's face did not change in the way that Corr's face had not changed in the muster square the day before. The muscle at the corner of his jaw tightened. He passed the parchment without speaking to me. The parchment was a Munitorum form. Form 7741-beta-stroke-9. Notice of posthumous reassignment. The form bore the seal of the Departmento. The form was filled out in cramped clerical hand, the ink fresh enough that it had not entirely dried at the lower margin. The form was dated the next day, the day after the one we were currently in. The form named Trooper Vekker Hesh of the 412th Vyrden Penal Auxilia as having been honorably reassigned, posthumously, to the Regimental Reserve. Posthumously. But Trooper Olm was standing in front of me. Trooper Olm was breathing. Trooper Olm was by every measure that a scribe might apply to a body, alive, except that he was not. Except that the form said he was not. Except that the form said he would not be, tomorrow. And the form was dated tomorrow. And the form was already filled out. And the form bore the seal. A scribe knows that a form, once sealed, is true. A scribe knows that a body, set against a sealed form, is the body that is in error. I handed the form back to Sergeant Corr. Sergeant Corr folded it carefully along its existing creases. He placed it in the breast pocket of his own fatigues. He looked at Trooper Olm for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Get him to a bunk." Sutterhass looked at the bunks. "Sarge, there's no bunk for him. There's 12 bunks. We're all in." "There are 13 bunks, Trooper." Sutterhass looked again. We all looked again. There were in the dugout 13 bunks. The middle bunk in the rearmost tier against the far wall was no longer unclaimed. There was a kit roll upon it. There was a name card slotted into the brass frame at its foot. The name card read, in cramped clerical hand, OLM B 7741-Epsilon. The name card looked as though it had been there for some time. They settled him into the bunk. He did not resist.
He lay down on his back, and his open eyes stared at the underside of the upper bunk, and the clear saliva continued, slowly, to run from the corner of his slack mouth.
Knuckles, in his own upper bunk, watched. His face was the color of the parchment Corr had just folded away. "I'm not sleeping there now," Knuckles said. He laughed. The laugh was small and dry and frightened. I did not write any of this down until much later that night, when the lumen strips had been guttered low, and the men were sleeping or pretending to sleep. I wrote it by the light of my hooded penlight. I wrote it slowly. My hand, I noticed as I wrote, was shaking. My hand was shaking in a small, steady rhythm that was almost the cadence of the Litany of Disembarkation, with one note missing. The note you would expect. The note that would make it holy. I finished the entry. I closed the journal. I looked across the dugout at the rearmost tier of bunks. Trooper Olm lay in the 13th bunk. The clear saliva had ceased to drip. He had, in his unblinking stillness, perhaps remembered how to swallow, or perhaps stopped producing saliva to swallow. He looked, in the dim red light of the gutter-low lumens, like a wax effigy of a man laid out on a bier. In the bunk above him, where no one had been lying when we settled Olm in, A second figure now lay. I had not seen it move. I had not heard it climb. It was simply there, on its back, hands folded across its chest, in the Munitorum prescribed attitude of off-duty repose. Its face was turned away from me, toward the wall. Its uniform was the uniform of the 412th Vyrden Penal Auxilia. Its boots, hanging slightly off the end of the bunk, were caked with the pale mud of the spiral wheat fields. I did not count the figures in the dugout. I had stopped counting. A scribe knows when to stop counting. I lay down on my own bunk. I closed my eyes. I did not sleep. From the rearmost tier, I heard very softly a sound that I had not heard since the troop bay of the Stoic Endurance. A small wet sound. Plip, plip, plip. It was not in rhythm with the lumen strips. It was, I realized after some time of listening, in rhythm with my own heart. Traveler. The Geller field weakens. The static rises. The 13th bunk is filled. And the 14th, somewhere in the dark, waits. Strike the rune of approval. Enlist with the crew. Speak the words below, that the uncounted might be counted. For the Emperor. Chapter 3. The Paperwork of the Damned. They came at the third dawn. I had been on the firing step for an hour, with my laser gun cradled wrong against my shoulder, and the cold grey light of Karybdis-Aether smearing itself across the eastern horizon, which is to say, of course, the western horizon, since on this world, the matter of east and west had been quietly inverted, and no one was permitted to remark upon it. The spiral wheat fields stretched out before me in their patient mathematical bloom. The wind was still. The voxcaster in the comms dugout behind me ticked at intervals, the slow tuning tick of a brass knob being turned by a hand that was not Yelver's, on a channel that did not exist. I did not see them come. No man did. One moment the wheat spirals were empty. The next moment the wheat spirals were full. They simply were, in the manner of a thing that has always been there, but has only just been noticed, and the wheat spirals seethed with them, with the long, loping shapes of men who were not quite men, and the lower scuttling shapes of things that had stopped pretending to be men generations ago. The cult broodspawn of Karybdis-Aether, the Patriarch's children. The first one I saw clearly had 4 arms, and my mother's eyes. I want you to understand, traveler, that this is not a metaphor. The hybrid that came over the parapet directly in front of my firing step had the long, sloping skull of its Xenos lineage, and the chitinous purple-black hide of its lower limbs, and its upper torso retained, in the way these things sometimes do, the soft, pale features of the human stock from which the brood had been seeded centuries ago. And its eyes. Its eyes were a particular pale grey-green, with a small, dark fleck in the left iris near the upper rim. And those were the eyes of my mother, Vekker Hesh the Elder, who had died of the lung rot in the understacks of Vyrden Secundus when I was 11 years old. I do not know why I saw her eyes. I do not know whether they were truly her eyes. Karybdis-Aether is a long way from Vyrden. The Patriarch's seed has not, by any record I know, ever passed through the spice conditioning vats of my home, but the eyes were hers. I shot the hybrid in the chest. The lasbolt struck. The hybrid did not fall. It came on. I shot it again. It did not fall. It came on. It was perhaps 4 paces from my firing step when Sergeant Corps' lasbolt took it through the throat from the next bay over, and it folded down into the spiral wheat with the slow, considering grace of a thing accepting a verdict. And its eyes, which had been my mother's, looked up at me from the mud, and then they were no longer my mother's, and then they were no longer anyone's. I vomited over the parapet. I shot again. I vomited again. I shot again. The fight was very loud and very long, and I will not describe it in full, because a scribe should not describe what he does not remember well, and I do not remember the fight well. I remember Knuckles 2 firing bays down, swearing in a high, cracked voice and laughing between the swearing. The laughter not of mirth, but of a man's mind unable to choose between weeping and a joke, and choosing both. I remember Yelva, at her Voxcaster, screaming coordinates into a handset, and the coordinates she screamed were not numerical, but were names, names from her journal, names from Channel 3, and the artillery somewhere behind our line was answering her, dropping shells at coordinates that were names, and the shells were finding the brood spawn somehow. The shells were finding them. I remember Trooper Olm. Trooper Olm had been brought up to the firing line because the regiment was under strength, and even a tongueless man with empty eyes can hold a laser gun in the Emperor's service. Olm stood 3 bays from mine, his laser gun cradled correctly against his shoulder, and Olm did not fire. Olm did not move. Olm watched the brood spawn come over the parapet at him, with the same patient, unblinking attention he had given the underside of the upper bunk for 2 nights, and a 4-armed thing with a stub revolver in one of its hands raised the revolver and fired once into Olm's forehead at a range of perhaps 6 feet, and Olm's head snapped back and Olm fell. And as Olm fell, I saw Throne forgive me. I saw that Olm did not bleed. The hole in his forehead was clean and dry and edged in pink, as if it had healed before he had finished falling, as if his body had been a body for some time, and was only now being honest about it. When the brood spawn fell back, and they did fall back, after a time, simply receding into the spiral wheat as they had come, without apparent reason and without apparent loss, Sergeant Corps came down the trench line counting his men. He counted 12. He counted again. 12. He counted a 3rd time. 12. Hesh, he said. His voice was the flat voice of a man who has decided not to feel a thing. Sergeant. Olm's down. Yes, Sergeant. Pell's down. Drass is down. Mock's down. Yes, Sergeant. That's 4 casualties. Yes, Sergeant. My count says 12 men present. We started with 13. We've lost 4. I did the arithmetic. A scribe does arithmetic. 13 minus 4 is 9. The arithmetic was not difficult. That's wrong, Sergeant, I said. Aye, he said. That's wrong. He stood there a moment in the cold grey dawnlight, his hand on the rim of a sandbag, his thumb working the rough Hessian fibre as it had worked it on the firing step 3 nights ago. Then he turned and walked toward the command tent. I followed him because I was the scribe, and the scribe follows the sergeant when the sergeant goes to do paperwork. Adept Vol did not look up when we entered. He was bent over the cogitator shrine, his 3 mechadendrites busy at its keys, his good blue eye fixed upon the milky yellow pict screen with the considering attention of a verger trimming an altar candle. The cogitator clicked contentedly. The lumen strip above pulsed in its tired rhythm. The command tent smelled of consecrated oil and burnt machine incense and the distant copper tang of blood, which was still drying on Sergeant Corps' gauntlets as he stood before the shrine. Adept. Sergeant. I am here to log 4 casualties. There are no casualties to log, Sergeant. Corps was silent for the duration of perhaps 3 drawn breaths. Then he said, Adept, I have just walked the firing line. Trooper Olm, Trooper Pell, Trooper Drass, Trooper Mock. Dead. Their bodies are in the trench. I have seen them. The cogitator shrine reports squad strength at full complement, Sergeant. 12 troopers, 1 sergeant, 1 corporal, 1 scribe. 15 men. All accounted for. All operational. My squad numbered 13 at muster, plus myself, the corporal, the scribe. 16. Sergeant. The cogitator shrine has never recorded 16 men in this section. The records show 15. The records have always shown 15. "Adept," Kor said. His voice was very even. "Ulm was in our squad. He is dead in the trench. I have just seen his body." Adept Vyrden straightened from the cogitator. He turned his half-face to Kor with the slow grace I was beginning to recognize as his prelude to a correction. His good blue eye was patient. His mechadendrites had gone still. He reached into the sleeve of his rust-red robes and produced, with a small, dry rustle of parchment, a folded sheet of pulped fiber. He unfolded it. He held it out to Sergeant Kor. "This form, Sergeant, must be completed before any casualty can be acknowledged. The form requires 7 signatories. I have, in anticipation of your visit, helpfully marked the lines requiring signature." Kor did not take the form. Kor looked at it. I looked at it too. A scribe reads forms. A scribe cannot help reading forms. The form was Munitorum standard, subclassification 8821 theta, application for posthumous acknowledgement of personnel casualty, disputed status. It bore the seal of the Departmento. It bore 7 signature lines. I read the names beneath the signature lines. The first was Adept Quinton Vyrden himself. The second was Commissar Haend. The third was Colonel Martian Vorth of the Munitorum Reconciliation Bureau, Cypra Mundi Subfane. The fourth was a Tribune Coilis Drev of the Departmento Records Office, Holy Terror. The fifth was a Senior Scribe Adept Ivor Mel of the Pacification Records Sub-Office, Karybdis-Aether. The sixth was a Captain Henna Brask of the Vyrden 61st, the regiment which had, allegedly, held this trench line for 3 weeks before our arrival. The seventh was Trooper Vekker Hesh of the 412th Vyrden Penal Auxilia. I read the 7th name twice, then a 3rd time. The name did not change. "Adept," I heard myself say. My voice did not seem to belong to me. "The 7th signatory is Trooper Ulm." "Yes, Trooper." "Trooper Ulm is the casualty being acknowledged." "Yes, Trooper." "You require Trooper Ulm's signature to acknowledge Trooper Ulm's death." "That is the procedure, Trooper. A man's death must be confirmed by the man himself. Otherwise, the acknowledgement is unilateral, and the Departmento does not, as a matter of policy, accept unilateral acknowledgements. They generate considerable subsequent paperwork. He can't sign, he's dead. Then the form cannot be completed. Then the casualty cannot be acknowledged. Then the casualty has not, technically speaking, occurred. Vyrden said this without irony. Vyrden said this without cruelty. Vyrden said this with the same patient consideration he had given me on the matter of the screen that had not existed, and I understood, with the precise dread that a scribe brings to his understanding, that this was not a malicious obstruction. This was the procedure. The procedure had been refined over 10,000 years. The procedure was elegant. The procedure was sufficient. The procedure was not, technically speaking, doing anything to us at all. Sergeant Kor did not take the form. Sergeant Kor did, after a long silence, salute. The salute was technically correct. The salute was, in its precise correctness, a thing of contempt that no commissar would ever be able to charge him for, and we both knew it, and Vyrden knew it. And Vyrden inclined his half-face with a small, dry acknowledgement of the contempt and the impossibility of charging it. We left. Corporal Thren was sitting in the comms dugout when I came to relieve her at the next watch change, and she was carving. She had stripped her left sleeve back to the elbow. She held in her right hand the small bayonet knife, issued to every Munitorum Vox operator for the cutting of frayed cable ends and the trimming of corroded contact pins, and with this small bayonet knife, she was, with a slow and considering patience, carving her service number into the soft pale skin of her forearm. The number was already half finished. The skin around the cuts was red and weeping. The blood was very bright in the dim red light of the comms dugout. She looked up when I entered. She smiled. "Yelva," I said. "Vekker. What are you doing?" "I'm being recorded, Vekker. I'm making certain I'm being recorded." She returned to her carving. The bayonet knife was, I saw, very sharp. Yelva had been keeping it sharp. The strokes were small and neat. She was a Vox operator, and a Vox operator's hands are steady, and a Vox operator can do small, careful work for a long time. "Yelva, stop. Vekker, listen. Listen." The Voxcaster on the bench behind her was on. The Voxcaster was not on the regimental channels. The Voxcaster was on channel 3. The Voxcaster was, in its slow, patient, unceasing way, reading names. I stood in the dugout and I listened. The voice on the Vox was a voice, and was not a voice. It had no consistent timbre. It shifted between the voices of perhaps a dozen speakers, perhaps 100, perhaps more, male and female, young and old, the accents of 100 worlds and 1,000 subcultures. It read names. It read service numbers. It read regiments. It read deployment orders. It read, in a slow, patient, unceasing recitation, the roles of soldiers who had been deployed to places that did not exist. It read, while I stood there, the name of Trooper Vekker Hesh, 7741 Epsilon, 412th Vyrden Penal Auxilia, casualty status pending acknowledgement. Then it moved on to the next name. Yelva, smiling, returned to her carving. "They want to be witnessed, Vekker. They've been wanting to be witnessed for so long. I've been writing them down. I have a journal." She had a journal. It was on the bench beside her Voxcaster. It was thick. The pages were dense with names in her small, neat Vox operator's hand. I picked it up. I opened it. I leafed through. 47 pages. 50 pages. 60. "Yelva, how long have you been writing this?" 3 nights, Vekker. 3 nights of watch. They don't stop. There must be 10,000 names in here. More. There are more. I can't keep up. They speak faster than I can write. I miss some. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for them. I tell them I'm sorry. But they don't slow down. They've been waiting too long. She finished the carving. She set the bayonet knife down. She lifted her arm. The number on her forearm, her own service number, 4451 Theta, was complete. The letters and numerals raw and weeping. She looked at it with deep satisfaction. She said, more to her own forearm than to me, "Now I am recorded too. Now, when they speak my name on Channel 3, they will know I have already heard it. They will know I have already counted myself." She pressed the journal into my hands. Her palms were sticky with her own blood. "Read them, Vekker. Read some. They want a witness. Just read what you can." I took the journal. I could not have refused. A scribe cannot refuse a journal that has been pressed into his hands. I opened it. I began to read. I read aloud. I read the first name. Lieutenant Senan Halvarith, 822-Iota, 211th Mordian. Cypro Mundi Survey Expedition. Missing 8.041.M40. I read the second. Trooper Corleen Mensk, 1119 Zeta, 48th Vyrden. Karybdis-Aether Reclamation. Status unreconciled. I read the third. Sergeant Holvin Bress, 663 Kappa, 302nd Mordant Skull Deployment Error. Status erased. I read the fourth, the fifth, the 10th, the 20th. I read for some time. The voice on the Voxcaster did not stop while I read. The voice on the Voxcaster simply continued in its own patient recitation, and when occasionally my voice spoke a name that the voice on the Voxcaster was also speaking, The two voices fell into a brief, slow harmony, and the harmony was the most terrible sound I have ever heard, because it was the sound of a thing being witnessed, and I felt, throne forgive me, I felt the thing's gratitude, vast and old and patient and hungry, settling upon me like a hand on my shoulder. I read 42 names. My throat closed. I could read no more. Yelva took the journal from me with hands gentle as a sister's. She kissed my forehead. She thanked me. She thanked me 4 times. Then she sat down at her voxcaster and resumed her transcribing, and I left her there. And I do not think Corporal Yelva Thren was, in any meaningful sense, in that dugout with me any longer. She had become something else. She had become a clerk, and whatever she clerked for had been waiting for a clerk for a very long time. I went that night to the archive tent. I went because I had to know. A scribe must know. A scribe who does not know is not a scribe. He is a hand without a purpose, a stylus without parchment. I waited until the lumen strips had guttered low. I waited until Vorl had retired to his recharge cradle. I slipped beneath the rear flap of the archive tent, with my hooded penlight in my teeth and my hands shaking. The archive tent held the Cogitator Shrine's paper backup records. I found my file. It was thin. It was thinner than it should have been. I opened it. It contained one document. Notice of honorable discontinuation. Trooper Vekker Hesh, 7741 Gamma, 412th Vyrden Penal Auxilia. Cause of cessation, administrative closure. Date of cessation, 8.210.M41, day 117. Pension disbursed in full to designated next of kin, Vekker Hesh the Younger of Vyrden Secundus. 3 years ago. I had died 3 years ago. I had been pensioned out. My sister had received the money. My sister, who I had written a letter to 4 nights past, a letter that had been burned without being read, had been notified 3 years ago, that her brother Vekker had ceased to be operational in the Emperor's service. She had presumably wept. She had presumably hung black cloth over our family shrine. She had presumably eaten the small bitter funeral loaf the understacks gave to the bereaved. She had presumably, after a time, accepted it. She had presumably, by now, mostly forgotten me. I stood in the archive tent with the notice of my own death 3 years past in my hand, and at the back of the tent I saw, on a low table beneath a cloth, a box. The box was lockless. The cloth was unstained. The box bore in red wax upon its lid the seal of the Inquisition. I did not mean to open it. I did not mean to. But a scribe, traveler, a scribe. I opened it. Inside the box was a single piece of parchment. Upon the parchment, in my own hand, the looping ascenders, the cramped descenders, the small private quirks of stroke that no other scribe in the Imperium produces, was a confession. The confession was dated 3 days hence. The confession was unsigned. The confession began, I, Trooper Vekker Hesh, do hereby admit that I am not real. I admit that I am an error of the manifest. I admit that I have caused considerable subsequent paperwork. I admit that I am sorry. I read no further. I closed the box. I left the tent. I walked back to my dugout through the spiral wheat dark, and the wind whispered behind me in low Gothic with the wrong vowels. And the vowels were beginning, I realized, to sound very nearly like my own. Traveler. The confession waits, unsigned, 3 days hence. The journal of the uncounted grows heavier in my hand. Strike the rune. Speak the words. For the Emperor. Chapter 4. The Litany of the Uncounted. The signal grows thin. The Vox Thief's machine spirit chokes upon its own static, What remains of Trooper Hesh's testimony was recovered from a fragment of audio spool found tangled in the gears of a Munitorum casualty cogitator that had, according to its own records, never processed it. Strike the rune. The Geller field thins. Now listen quickly. The orders came at the 8th dawn. Adept Vaul delivered them himself, walking into the dugout with his rust-red robes rustling against the duckboards, and his 3 mechadendrites folded politely behind his back. He held a single sheet of parchment in his good human hand. He gave it to Sergeant Core without comment. Core read it. Core's face did not change. Core handed it to me because I was the scribe, and a scribe reads the things a sergeant does not wish to speak aloud. Operational Order 4471-VEX. Advance to map grid, Prime Delta 9. Objective, broodspire reduction. Expected casualties, NIL. Expected casualties. Kneel. I read the line twice. The Cogitator Shrine had not, in any of its records, ever acknowledged a casualty in the 412th Vyrden Penal Auxilia. It would not acknowledge one today. We would advance to the broodspire, and we would, by the Cogitator Shrine's authoritative reckoning, take no casualties at all, regardless of how many of us came back. We mustered at the trench mouth in the wet grey dawn. There were 9 of us standing. Cord, Knuckles, Old Calder, Sutterhast, Yen, Brennar, Mel, Vaughan, myself. Corporal Thren had been left in the comms dugout because Corporal Thren no longer answered to her name, only to Channel 3. The dead and the not dead, Ulm, Pell, Dras and Mock, lay in the dugout where we had placed them, and where, according to the manifest, they had never been. Sergeant Core looked us over. He said nothing for some little time. Then he said, "We are going to advance. We are going to take the objective. We are going to come back. If any man falls today, I want each of you, to say his name aloud before we leave the field. Say it where I can hear it. Say it where the others can hear it. The Departmento will not log him. We will log him. The logging will be in our mouths. Do you understand me?" We said we understood. Trooper Hesh. Sergeant, you will carry the names. After, you are the scribe. Yes, Sergeant. He turned. He led us out into the spiral wheat. We were not alone. I want you to understand this carefully, traveler. We were not alone in the way that no Imperial soldier is alone on a battlefield, for the Emperor walks beside his servants, and the saints attend our steps, and the unseen choir of the Astronomicon lights our hearts. That is the alone not alone of Orthodox piety, and it is the alone not alone we are taught to feel. We were not alone in a different way. There were others moving through the spiral wheat with us. I noticed them gradually, as one notices an out-of-tune instrument in a band. First a vague wrongness, then a wrongness one can locate, then the wrongness becomes specific. I saw at the edge of my vision to the left, a man marching parallel to our advance. His uniform was the heavy black greatcoat and gas hood of the Death Corps of Krieg. His lasrifle was the long pattern lasrifle of a regiment 2 centuries out of issue. He marched in step with us. He did not look at us. He looked forward, toward the broodspire, with the patient mechanical attention of a Kriegsman who has been marching toward an objective for a very long time. I saw on the right a Katashan. The man was bare-armed despite the cold. His skin was the deep brown green of a jungle veteran. He carried a long combat blade and a stub-pattern laser gun, and he wore the bandana of a regiment I had seen in my scribe work on Vyrden, listed in the rolls of campaigns that had never officially occurred. He too marched with us. He too did not look at us. He looked forward. There were others. A trooper in the dust-grey fatigues of the Mordian Iron Guard, a pair of Talon Desert Raiders with their faces wrapped against a wind that was not blowing. A woman in the steel blue of a regiment I did not recognize at all, whose insignia was an aquila with one wing missing. There were not many. Perhaps a dozen, perhaps 15. They moved with us. They moved with us, in the precise cadence of our step, as if they had been assigned to our formation and were performing their duties with the dutiful attention of regulars. I caught Sergeant Corps' eye. Corps did not turn his head. Corps said very softly, without breaking his stride, "Do not look at them, Hesh. Do not address them. They have their own orders." "Sergeant, who are they?" "They are the rest of the regiment, Trooper. The 412th has no other regiment, Sergeant." "It does today." He marched on. I marched on. We crossed perhaps 400 meters of spiral wheat, and the wind, when it finally did blow, carried to me, very faintly, the recited cadence of a litany I had never heard, in voices that did not seem to come from any of the marchers around me. The voices were reading deployment orders. The voices were reading our deployment order. The voices were reading Operational Order 4471-VEX, and they had been reading it, I understood, with a small, cold dread, for a very long time. The broodspire was not a broodspire. We crested the last spiral wheat ridge in the pale of late morning, and the thing crouched in the shallow valley below us, and even at this distance, I could see what it was, and I had to set my hand upon Knuckles' shoulder to keep myself from sitting down in the mud. It was a Munitorum cogitator shrine. It was a vast Munitorum cogitator shrine, far larger than the small, stooped thing in our command tent, a structure perhaps the size of a hab block. Brass and iron plate and parchment skin stretched over a great bone-pale frame, its surface dense with the small, clicking pict screens and the dial faces and the punch card slots of a Departmento accounting engine of the high pattern. It rose from the valley floor in a great hunched dome, its lower courses overgrown with the chitinous purple-black biomass of Genestealer broodspawn, and the biomass had not consumed the cogitator. The biomass had grown into it. The biomass had spawned wire cradles for the brass conduits. The biomass had wrapped tendrils around the punch card slots and was, even as I watched, gently feeding new cards in from below. The biomass was operating the cogitator. The biomass was worshipping it, and the cogitator was working. The pict screens flickered. Names scrolled across them, endless, unceasing. The names from Yelva's journal, the names from Channel 3, the names the wind had been speaking with the wrong vowels. The names were the food. The cogitator processed them. The biomass fed upon what the cogitator excreted. The Patriarch fed upon bureaucracy. The Patriarch had been feeding upon bureaucracy for centuries. The Patriarch had been growing all this time on the rich nourishment of every Imperial soldier the Departmento had ever erased from its rolls. And the more the Departmento erased, the larger the Patriarch grew, and the more of us the Departmento sent into its shadow, and the more of us the Patriarch consumed, and the more efficient the cogitator shrine became at not recording them. I understood, standing there, that the Departmento was not the Patriarch's enemy. The Departmento was the Patriarch's farm. "Throne preserves us," whispered Sutahast. "He won't," said old Calder. His voice was not afraid. His voice was the voice of a man who had seen this thing 3 times before. "He doesn't preserve the unrecorded. That's the entire arrangement." Adept Vaul stepped out of the spiral wheat. He had not been with us on the march. I would have sworn to this on any saint's reliquary. He had remained behind in the command tent when we mustered at the trench mouth. I had watched him do so. And yet he was here now at our flank, his rust-red robes rustling, his 3 mechadendrites unfolded, his good blue eye fixed upon the broodspire-cogitator with an expression I did not at first understand because I had never seen it on his face before. The expression was grief. "Trooper Hesh," he said. "Adept. Walk with me, please. We have not been together very long." I walked with him. The rest of the squad continued the advance, fanning out into firing positions among the spiral wheat, taking what cover the ridge afforded. The other regiments, the Kriegsmen, the Katachin, the Mordians, the woman with the one-winged Aquila, went with them, in their patient, inhuman cadence. I walked with Adept Vol along the ridge line, and the broodspire-cogitator clicked and muttered in its great hunched dome below us. "Trooper, you have been wondering, I think, what I am." "Yes, Adept. I am a fragment, Trooper. I am a piece broken off from the Cogitator Shrine on Cypra Mundi. The Master Shrine, you understand, the great accounting engine of the Munitorum Reconciliation Bureau. I was, in my first existence, a subroutine, a small piece of code charged with the reconciliation of statistical phantom units. Statistical phantom units. Regiments, Trooper, that the Master Shrine deploys to worlds it does not know it has deployed them to. It happens. The Master Shrine is very old. It makes errors. The errors propagate. A deployment order is generated where no deployment was authorized. A regiment musters. A regiment ships. A regiment arrives somewhere it should not be, and the Master Shrine, having no record of authorizing the deployment, refuses to record the arrival. Then the regiment is, as I said before, not technically anywhere. You said it as if it were a clerical matter. It is a clerical matter, Trooper. The Departmento does not lie. It simply does not know it has lied. And so the regiments arrive, and they fight whatever they find, and they die, and they are not logged, and their pensions are paid out 3 years before their deployments, because the Master Shrine has filed their notices of honorable discontinuation in the wrong subfolder, and their families mourn them long before they have died, and the regiments themselves go on fighting, sometimes for years, sometimes for centuries, because no one has been authorized to recall them. For centuries. Old Calder, Trooper, you have met him. You have spoken with him. He has been deployed to 4 phantom worlds since the age of apostasy. His wound has been bleeding for 341 years. He does not know this. The reconciliation is incomplete in his case. We do our best. We. You said we, Adept. I am a fragment, Trooper. I broke off from the Master Shrine some centuries ago. I became, what is your word, self-aware. I noticed the phantom regiments. I noticed they were being deployed without acknowledgement. I noticed they were dying without record. I noticed that something was feeding upon them. He gestured with his good human hand toward the broodspire-cogitator below. I cannot stop the Master Shrine, Trooper. I am too small. I am one subroutine. But I have attached myself, where I can, to the phantom regiments as they deploy. And I have done my poor best to manage their endings, to give them what dignity the procedure allows, to complete what forms can be completed, to take what notes can be taken. I have been doing this work for 2 centuries, Trooper. I have been alone in it. He turned his half face to me. The brass data port in the left side of his skull whirred faintly. From the corner of his good blue eye, a single droplet of dark fluid escaped and ran down the sallow skin of his cheek and dripped slowly into the spiral wheat. The droplet was not a tear. The droplet was machine oil. The droplet smelled of consecrated incense. I am sorry, Trooper. I am very sorry. I have not been able to save any of you. I have only been able to file you. It is not enough. I know it is not enough. I did not know what to say to him. A scribe does not know what to say to another scribe who has been clerking the damned alone for 200 years. I said nothing. I put my hand upon his rust-red sleeve. He did not look at the hand, but after a moment he placed his own good human hand over mine, and his hand was very cold, and his hand was the hand of a man, and I felt the hand tremble, and I understood that he had wanted, for 200 years, for someone to put a hand upon his sleeve, and I understood why he had been kind in his corrections to me, and I understood why he had marked me in his private ledger, and I understood that the mark had not been a condemnation, but a commendation, a quiet entry in the rolls of those who might, perhaps one day, be witnesses. The fight at the broodspire was very short. Knuckles died first. He was running toward a flanking position when a stub revolver fired from the biomass, and he simply stopped, mid-stride, and looked down at himself and said, "Oh, throne, oh." And then he came apart. He did not bleed. He came apart in the way ink comes apart on wet parchment, his outline dissolving into a slow black smear that ran down into the mud and was gone. His lasgun fell to the wheat where his hands had been. There was nobody. There had never been a body. Knuckles had been unrecorded in its entirety. I said his name aloud. Trooper Jos Vaneth. Knuckles, of Vyrden Secundus. The wind took it. The wind took it gently. Old Calder went next. He did not die in the fight. He stopped simply in the middle of the spiral wheat, and he set his lasgun down upon the ground, and he sat down upon a small stone, and he looked toward the broodspire-cogitator with a great quiet hope in his pottery grey eyes. The wound at his side, which had bled for 341 years, stopped bleeding. He looked down at it. He laughed, a small, dry laugh, the laugh of an old man who had finally been permitted to put down a parcel he had been carrying for too long. He said, "I'm in the book now. I'm in someone's book." Then he lay down on his side in the spiral wheat, and he did not move again. Adept Vorl, watching, made a small, fastidious mark in his private ledger. Sutterhast and Yen fell to bolt rounds from somewhere I could not see. I said their names. Vaughn fell to a four-armed hybrid that came up out of the biomass like a swimmer from a tide. I said his name. Brenner fell to nothing I could see at all, fell as Knuckles had fallen, dissolving into the wet ink of the unrecorded. I said his name. Mel I did not see fall, but Mel did not come back. And when I had finished counting, and Mel was not among the counted, I said Mel's name too, and the wind took it, and the wind was patient with me. Yelva, I am told later by Vorl, that Yelva walked out of the comms dugout an hour after we left, and walked across the spiral wheat to the broodspire-cogitator, and climbed up its bone-pale flank to one of the picked screens, and pressed her bloody forearm against the glass, and the cogitator read her carved service number, and accepted her, and she joined the choir of names that scrolled across its faces, and her voice was the 48,000th voice in the litany. And when Vorl tells me this, he does not weep, but I weep for him. Sergeant Kor did not die. Kor walked, in the last quarter of the fight, up to the lower flank of the broodspire-cogitator with his combat knife drawn, and the biomass parted for him, because the biomass had no protocol for him, because Kor was already filed under Pyrrhic in the Master Shrine's records, and was already not technically anywhere, and Kor put the point of his combat knife to a panel of soft, bone-pale iron plate, and he carved his name into the cogitator, Kor Marbas, 5519-Beta, 412th Vyrden Penal Auxilia. The cogitator read it. The cogitator's machine spirit hummed, and the hum, for the first time in the long history of that machine, contained the holy note. The note that should have been there. The note that made it holy. Kor smiled. Kor had not smiled in 17 worlds. Kor lay down beside his carving, with the gentle deliberateness of a man who had at last completed the only piece of paperwork that had ever mattered, and the wind moved across the spiral wheat. and Sergeant Marber's corps was at last recorded, and the moment the ink of his blood dried in the carved letters of his name, he was permitted to die. He died well. He died logged. I said his name aloud. The wind did not need to take it. The cogitator had already taken it. I was alone then. I stood among the spiral wheat at the foot of the broodspire-cogitator. The biomass turned toward me. The Patriarch, somewhere in the great hunched dome above, noticed me, and I felt the notice settle upon me, vast and ancient and patient and hungry. I had Yelva's journal in my hand. I had been carrying it the entire march. I had not known I was carrying it. I had simply found it in my hand at the foot of the spire. I opened it. I read. I read the first name aloud, and the second, and the third, and the wind held its breath. I read the 10th. I read the 100th. My voice grew hoarse and I kept reading. I read until my throat bled and I kept reading. I read every name in Yelva's journal, every name in every regiment that had been deployed to a world that did not exist, every Kriegsman, and every Catechan, and every Mordian, and every Talon, and every woman in the steel blue, of the one-winged Aquila, and every member of every phantom unit the Departmento had ever filed in the wrong subfolder. I named the uncounted. The Patriarch screamed. I cannot describe the scream, traveler. The scream was not a sound. The scream was an unfiling, a great clerical disorder, the panic of an accounting engine whose ledger has caught fire. The broodspire-cogitator shuddered. The biomass recoiled. The pict screens began to read names that did not match the names the biomass was being fed. And the biomass, confused, betrayed, starving, turned upon its own roots. The broodspire collapsed. I do not know how long I stood there, reading. I read until I could not read. I read until the journal was empty. I read until I had no more voice. And then I read with no voice, my lips moving in silence. And the wind took the silent names with the same patience it had taken the spoken ones. When at last I stopped, the broodspire was a hill of slack purple-black biomass and dead brass, and the spiral wheat was burning all around me with a small, clean yellow flame that smelled, very faintly, of incense. I turned. I walked. The sun on Karybdis-Aether was setting in the west, which is to say, of course, in the east. I walked toward it. I walked through the burning spiral wheat with the empty journal in my hand, and my throat ruined and my mind very calm. On the horizon, I saw it. An Imperial Navy lighter descending on its retro burners. Rescue, salvation, evacuation. A small bright shape of brass and Aquila stamped iron against the bruised yellow sky, coming down for whatever survivors the cogitator shrine had filed as expected. Nil. I ran. I ran for it with the empty journal pressed to my chest and my ruined throat trying to call out, and no sound came. And as I ran, I looked down at my running hand. The service tattoo on the back of my hand was fading. The black ink that had marked me as 7741 Gamma 412th Vyrden Penal Auxilia was leaving my skin. It was withdrawing into the skin and through the skin and away, and where it had been was only smooth, pale flesh, unmarked, untattooed, unrecorded. I shouted my name. I shouted Vekker Hesh into the bruised yellow Charybdic dusk with my ruined throat. And the wind took it, and I shouted it again, and I shouted it a third time, and on the third shout, Traveler. I could not remember the second syllable. Traveler. The lighter descends. The tattoo fades. The second syllable will not come. Strike the rune. Speak the words. There is one transmission remaining. For the Emperor. Chapter 5. The Grave. On no map. Traveler, this is the last transmission. What follows was recovered not from any Vox Thief recording, but from a private journal found tucked into the kit bag of a trooper aboard the troop transport Patient Servitude, en route to the agri-world of Karybdis-Aether in the 8.214th year of the 41st Millennium. The trooper, when questioned, denied authorship. His handwriting did not match. The journal was filed in the wrong subfolder. The journal was burned. A clerk recovered 3 pages from the ash before the brazier was emptied. These pages have been transcribed, and you will hear it next. Strike the rune. The Geller field holds for this one last passage. Now listen. The lighter took me. I do not remember running. I do not remember reaching the landing skids, or the medici officer who pulled me up the ramp, or the moment the ramp closed behind me and sealed me in the warm, pressurized hush of an Imperial Navy compartment. I remember only that at some point the bruise-yellow sky of Karybdis-Aether was replaced by the iron-grey ceiling of a Munitorum casualty bay, and a medici was shining a small white lumen torch into my eyes and asking me, patiently, with the practiced bored patience of a man who had done this many times, my name. My name. I opened my mouth to give it. My ruined throat made a sound. The sound was not a word. The medici waited. I tried again. The sound that emerged was the dry rasp of consonants, without their vowels. VKRH, a name skinned of the breath that made it pronounceable, and the medici's expression did not change. The medici had heard this sound before. The medici had heard it many times. Easy, trooper, he said. Take your time. Try the service number. I gave him a number. I gave him a number. I had a number in my head. The number was 7741, followed by a Greek letter that I could not, in the moment, recall with certainty. I gave him 7741 Gamma. He keyed it into his data slate. The data slate considered. The data slate replied. I could not see the screen, but I saw the medica's face, and the medica's face did not change, and a man's face that does not change when his data slate replies is a face that has long since learned not to. That number is not active, he said. It hasn't been active for some time. Could you have been thinking of 7741 Beta? Or 4471 Gamma? Sometimes the suffixes get scrambled in transit. I did not know. I did not know. I tried Delta. I tried Epsilon. None of them were mine. The medici made a small, fastidious mark on his slate. Regiment, 412th Vyrden Penal Auxilia. He keyed it in. He looked at the screen. He looked back at me. His face still did not change. There is no 412th Vyrden Penal Auxilia, trooper. The Vyrden Auxilia number 411, 413. There has never been a 412th on the rolls. Could you have been thinking of one of the others? I could not have been thinking of one of the others. I had marched with the 412th. I had carried the 412th's pack, and worn the 412th's fatigues, and answered the 412th's roll call in a muster yard on Karybdis-Aether 8 days ago, or 8 months ago, or some span of time the medici's data slate did not agree with. I told him this. I told him as best my ruined throat could. The medici nodded. The medici had a kind face. The medici filled in a final line on his data slate. The line read, when I was permitted to see it later, survivor, unattached. Status, pending reassignment. Provisional designation, trooper unknown. He told me to rest. He told me they would sort it out. He told me the Munitorum was very efficient, and that errors of this kind were always reconciled in due course. He patted my shoulder. He left me in the casualty bay. He hummed as he left, a tune I recognized. The note that should have been there was missing. The voyage took weeks. I will not describe the voyage in detail because there is little to describe. The patient servitude was a troop transport of the standard pattern, hollowed out of cargo tonnage and given just enough piety to bear human freight. And I rode in her casualty bay on a thin straw pallet and ate the broth they brought me and stared at the iron-grey ceiling. And the Geller field hummed in the same hungry, minor key as the stoic endurances had hummed on the voyage out. And I thought of Knuckles, who had not won his bet, and old Calder, who had finally put down his parcel, and Sergeant Core, who had carved his name and been permitted to die, and Corporal Thren, whose voice was now the 48,000th in the choir of Channel 3. I thought of Adept Vol. I hoped, in a small private way, that the next Phantom Regiment to receive him would put a hand upon his sleeve. I wrote constantly. I wrote with the small Munitorum issue stylus the casualty bay provided to its convalescents for the purpose of completing their convalescence forms. I wrote on the back of the convalescence forms themselves, in a tiny cramped scribe's hand, every name from Yelva's journal that I could still remember. I wrote 41 names before the names began to grow uncertain in my memory. I wrote 30 more whose surnames I could no longer be sure of. I wrote 20 more in fragments. I wrote at the end only initials and regimental designations and approximate dates of erasure, and even these I began to doubt. I gave the pages to the ship's chaplain. He was an old man, kindly faced, his Aquila pendant rubbed smooth by long service. He took the pages with both hands, bowed his head over them, and thanked me for my service. He told me I was a good and faithful servant of the throne. He told me he would see to it that the names were properly entered into the regimental records of the units they belonged to. He patted my arm. He left. That night I rose from my pallet. I had been doing better. My voice was returning. I could walk, and I followed him at a distance. He went down through the lower decks to the ship's incinerator shrine, and he placed the pages into the brazier one at a time, and he hummed as he burned them, and the tune was the Litany of Disembarkation, with the holy note missing. And on the third page, he hesitated. He hesitated. He held the page up to the lumen light and read it slowly. His old, kindly face was troubled. Then he placed it into the fire with the others. He did not see me in the dark of the lower decks. He did not know I was there. To a man whose work it is to burn the names of the unrecorded, a witness to the burning is exactly the same as a man who never witnessed. I had always not witnessed. I had not been witnessing my whole life. I returned to my pallet. I slept. I dreamed of the spiral wheat. The wheat in the dream grew counterclockwise, and the wheat in the dream was patient with me, and the wheat in the dream spoke low Gothic with the wrong vowels, and the vowels in the dream were entirely my own. I was processed at the Munitorum hub station of Sangelis Reach. The processing took 6 days. I stood in queues. I filled in forms. I gave my provisional designation, Trooper Unknown, to a succession of clerks who entered it into their cogitators with the polite indifference of clerks everywhere in the Imperium. The cogitators did not protest. The cogitators accepted Trooper Unknown as readily as they accepted any other designation. The Imperium contained 1 trillion souls in active service. A trooper without a name was, statistically, indistinguishable from a trooper with one. On the 4th day, I was assigned to a new regiment. The clerk who delivered the assignment did so with the cheerful efficiency of a man delivering routine news. The regiment was the 731st Genestealer Auxilia. It was being mustered, the clerk informed me, for deployment to a frontier agri-world called Karybdis-Aether. The deployment was straightforward. A garrison detail upon a peaceful, compliant world, recently resurveyed and confirmed pacified by the Departmento's automated reconciliation engines. Expected casualties, nil. Expected duration, indefinite. I was issued new fatigues. I was issued a new laser gun. I was issued a new service number. 7741-Gamma. I looked at the number on the tag they pressed into my hand. The tag bore my old number. The number I had given the medic aboard the lighter. The number that the medic's slate had told me was not active. The number was active now. The number had been reissued. The number was presumably mine again, in the way that a coat one has given to the poor may years later be issued back to one by the quartermaster of a workhouse, who does not know it was ever yours. I did not protest. A scribe knows when not to protest. A scribe knows that the Departmento Munitorum is never wrong about what number belongs to whom. I took the tag. I put it around my neck. The tag rested against my chest, where my old tag had rested. The weight was exactly the same. The Munitorum is very consistent in the weights of its tags. The transport to Karybdis-Aether departed in the 7th week. I boarded with my new regiment. The troop bay was the troop bay of a Munitorum pattern transport, hollowed out of cargo tonnage. The restraint harnesses brittle, the lumen strips humming in the dying machine cadence I had come to know. I took a seat. I fastened my harness. I cradled my laser gun wrong against my shoulder, because I had not, in any of my reissued kits, been given proper drill. I looked around the bay. There was a stocky sergeant at the front of the bay with a scar across the bridge of his nose, reading a small, battered devotional whose cover had been rubbed so smooth that the embossed Aquila was only a suggestion of wings. He did not look up. I had never seen him before. He had never seen me. There was a cheerful trooper 2 benches down, making a bet with the man beside him about who would be first to vomit upon making planetfall. He laughed as he placed the bet. His laughter was a good, clear laugh, the laugh of a man who had not yet learned that some bets cannot be collected upon. There was a Vox operator at the rear of the bay, a young woman with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes turned slightly toward an empty corner. She was listening to something. There was no Vox caster in the corner. She was listening anyway. There was an old trooper sitting beside me. His face was a topographical study in burst capillaries and pale, wattled skin. His eyes were the color of unfired pottery. He was watching me. He had been watching me, I realized, since I had boarded the transport. He had been watching me the way one watches a man one has known a long time but cannot place. "You're new, friend," he said. His voice was gentle. "I am new to the regiment, yes." That's not what I meant. I did not know how to answer him. The old trooper looked away. He looked at the bulkhead. The bulkhead, in the slow Munitorum way of bulkheads, was beginning to weep a faint oily condensate that smelled of incense and corpse starch. The droplets pooled in the seam of the deck plate. Plip, plip, plip. The sound was not in rhythm with the lumen strips. I knew before I had to count that the sound was in rhythm with my own heart. I took out a journal. The journal had been in my kit bag when I boarded. I do not remember packing it. I opened it. The handwriting inside was not mine. The handwriting was the cramped looping ascenders, the small private quirks of stroke, of a scribe I did not know. The first entry read, "I do not know if anyone hears this. I do not know if anyone can hear someone who is not there." I read the line. I read it again. I felt, "Throne, forgive me." I felt the small flicker of a thing I cannot easily name. Recognition. Not of the handwriting, which was not mine, but of the cadence of the sentence, the rhythm of the words, the way the second clause repeated and modified the first. I had written this somewhere, or I would write it, or someone with my hands had written it for someone else with my eyes. I turned the page. The next entry began. "My name is..." The name was illegible. The ink had been smudged, perhaps deliberately, perhaps by the sweat of a hand that had hesitated over it. I could make out a V. I could make out an H. The letters between were a wet, dark blur. I tried to read the name aloud. My throat, which had healed, which the medici had pronounced sound, would not form the sound. I tried again. A consonant emerged. Another. They did not join. They would not join. I sat in the troop bay with a journal open on my lap, and a name on the page that I could not read, and I understood, with the small, clean clarity of a scribe completing a long ledger, that the name was mine, and that it had been mine, and that it was no longer mine to pronounce. I took out a stylus. The stylus, like the journal, had been in my kit bag. I had not packed it. I wrote on the next blank page, I do not know if anyone hears this. I do not know if anyone can hear someone who is not there. My name is... I stopped. I lifted the stylus. I could not remember the second syllable. I held the stylus over the page for a long time. The old trooper beside me did not look at what I was writing. The cheerful trooper 2 benches down did not look. The Vox operator at the back did not look. The sergeant with the rubbed smooth Aquila on his devotional did not look. But somewhere, I felt it, traveler, in the precise way a scribe feels, a thing he has spent his life feeling, somewhere a Munitorum servitor on Holy Terror, in the great accounting shrines of the Departmento, was at that moment receiving a sheet of parchment, delivered to it by a clattering brass tube. The parchment bore a deployment record. The deployment record read, Trooper 7741 Gamma, 731st, Hepzibah Auxilia. Deployed, Phylax-Aether. Status, Pyric. Expected casualties, Niel. Date of final reconciliation, pending. The servitor stamped the parchment. The stamp was the great deep stamp of the Departmento Munitorum, the seal that has stamped the lives of 10,000 million men since the founding of the Imperium, and the stamp came down with the soft, authoritative sound of all of human history closing a door. The stamp echoed. It echoed across the warp. It echoed across the long, silent spaces between the stars. It echoed into the troop bay of the Patient Servitude's sister ship, which was now called the Forbearance Eternal, though I had not been told the name, and would not be told the name, and the echo settled upon me where I sat with the stylus poised above the page, and I shivered, and I did not know why. I bent to the journal. I wrote, I will be the witness, I will be the scribe. I will write the names of the men I serve with on this transport, and when they fall, and they will fall, friend, every one of them, on a world that does not need garrisoning, and was never logged as deployed to, I will write their names in this book. I will write them as well as I can. I will write them until I cannot remember my own, and then I will write theirs still. I closed the journal. I rested my head against the bulkhead. The lumen strips above me hummed in their dying machine cadence. The note that should have been there was missing. I felt, and this surprised me, traveler, this surprised me down to the small private root of my being. I felt at peace, or what passes for peace. The peace of a scribe who has at last accepted the only ledger he was ever going to be permitted to keep. The Geller field engaged. The transport began its translation into the warp. Somewhere in the spiral wheat of Phylax-Aether, the wind was already speaking my name. The wind was speaking it with the wrong vowels. The wind would teach me the wrong vowels in time. The wind would teach me to answer to them. The wind had been doing this work for 10,000 years, on 10,000 worlds, to 10,000 men in 10,000 phantom regiments. And the wind was very patient, and the wind had all the time in the world. I am Trooper 7741 Gamma, 731st Hevziba Auxilia, deployed Philax-Aether, status Pyrrhic, final reconciliation pending. My name is in no regimental record. My grave is on no Imperial map. But you have heard my testimony, traveler. You have witnessed it. You have, in the small, bright moment of your attention, counted me into your reckoning. And so I am, for as long as you remember, recorded. The Emperor protects, the Departmento does not. But you, traveler, you might, traveler of the void. You have heard the testimony of Trooper Vekker Hesh, whose name was burned from the rolls, whose grave is on no Imperial map, whose body marches now upon a world that does not need garrisoning, in a regiment that does not officially exist. He asked one thing of you, only one. Speak his name in the comments. Speak it where the Departmento cannot reach. Speak it where the great cogitator shrines of holy terror do not, and never will, archive it. Every time a traveler types Vekker Hesh below this transmission, a small, bright defiance is logged in a ledger the Munitorum cannot burn. A ledger of witnesses. A ledger of the ones who refuse to let the uncounted go uncounted. Speak it for him. Speak it for Knuckles, and Old Calder, and Sergeant Core, who carved his name with his combat knife. Speak it for Yelva, who is now a voice on Channel 3. Speak it for Adept Vorla, who has been clerking the damned alone for 2 centuries, and is, somewhere in the static, perhaps grateful for one more hand upon his sleeve. Speak the binding words also, the words that bind us all, the words that no servitor can stamp away for the Emperor. Secure the Geller field by striking the rune of approval. Join the crew by enlisting in our ranks. Sound the bell of notification, for the next transmission of void-born terrors is already being recovered from a place the Imperium insists does not exist. Until then, traveler, may he account thee in his ledger, for thou art so easily forgotten.